as Dave said, this discussion obviously and clearly continues on from the morning session. And actually I'd like to start my contribution by emphasising one of the points that was made this morning, and that is that a lot of the talk that's happened since the election victory of Jeremy Corbyn, concentrating on the idea of winning in 2012, actually ignores the fact, which I think was made by Councillor Kevin Bennett, that Jeremy Corbyn's victory actually provides an opportunity to build a movement that could drive the Tories out well before 2020. The reality is, as we've explained before, only 24% of the electorate voted for the Tories. There's never been a Tory government with such a low base of support before in history, never. Even Thatcher, when she won in 1987, won with 32% of the electorate, 42% of those who voted, before she went on to introduce the poll tax, which of course led to her demise 3 years later. Now there are a number of flashpoints that could actually lead to a movement that defeats this government. The trade union bill is one of them. That could be the issue that drives out the government. A youth revolt is inevitable and also could be a catalyst in the next period. But the other aspects of the austerity agenda, where Jeremy Corbyn's victory could have a big impact, and where TUSC, both in its local campaigning and as an electoral coalition, could play a critical and crucial role, is the new assault that is coming on local public services and the possibilities there for a fight back. Because the title of this session, as Dave said, alongside agreeing the local elections policy platform that's on pages 3 and 4 of your conference agenda, the title of this session is, Are there new prospects for a councillor's revolt? And the answer, even before Jeremy Corbyn's victory, was yes, because councils are, first of all, an alternative source of power, and secondly, councils are facing cuts on a monumental scale in the November public spending review, and that will provoke a reaction. But the answer is even more definitely yes after Jeremy Corbyn's victory. There is no excuse left now for Labour councillors to go against Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's anti-austerity call and vote for cuts in the council chamber. And let's make it absolutely clear from this conference that all TUSC members and supporters are absolutely clear. Councils do have the power to resist Tory austerity, and it is to the credit of our coalition, to the credit of TUSC, that has been TUSC and TUSC alone that has pioneered in recent years the ideas for how councils can use their powers, or could use their powers, particularly around the question of reserves and borrowing powers to set no-cuts budgets. It's not been the Greens, for example, who have over 160 councillors. And there's not a single example that I'm aware of, actually, where the Greens have presented an alternative no-cuts budget that would have meant no cuts for a particular council. Or, in fact, also the Labour left as well. There was a group set up in 2012, Councillors Against the Cuts. It did involve genuine Labour councillors who did genuinely oppose the cuts, but the reality is all of those councillors who were on Labour councils was not councils where you don't actually have to take responsibility. You can vote against the Tories and keep your banner clean. But in those councils where they were Labour councils, those councillors who signed up at that stage for Councillors Against the Cuts, they've either been expelled from the Labour Party and are working now with TUSC, or they bowed to the pressure and in many cases resigned or indeed voted for cuts. So it's only been TUSC and supporters and councillors around TUSC who have gone into the council chamber and presented alternative budgets. And we have helped produce alternative no-cuts budgets which were presented to the council budget meetings. And I make a nod to comments like Kevin. You can't present a council alternative budget if you're the only councillor in the council. You need someone to second them. So it's only been where there's been 2 TUSC supporters in Southampton, in Leicester, and in Hull. And we have presented those alternative budgets in those councils, which have been no-cuts budgets. And that's been a pioneering work which we should be proud of. But in the new situation of Jeremy Corbyn's victory, we need to step up campaigning around the idea cuts aren't necessary, councils can resist them, that the Tories can be defeated and local public services can be saved. But it won't be an easy battle that we have to go into. There's been no local government revolts for 30 years since the struggle in the 1980s, in particular the struggle led by the Liverpool councillors, but also taking Lambeth Council into confrontation with the government as well. Actually, 30 years since the time also when John McDonnell himself was a GLC councillor in London, and actually, for the record, he came into conflict with Ken Livingstone, who wanted to retreat in the 1980s. John McDonnell clashed with Livingstone at that stage, so he wanted to stand firm. But there hasn't been struggles in local government for 30 years. And while Jeremy Corbyn had a declared support of 450 councillors, which is quite significant, that could be an important lever for building the anti-austerity movement in the next period. There are actually 7,000 Labour councillors. In other words, he had more support as a percentage in the parliamentary party than he has in the council chambers up and down the country, which shows the scale of the task that exists. So the task of TUSC, as we discussed this morning, is to organise support for the Corbyn Labour Party against the austerity Labour Party, the two Labour parties that exist at the present time. And that includes, and I accept these points, and this is an important point, we discussed this on the steering committee, that includes where the work is being done. The slogan that was discussed at the steering committee was we should stand widely but not indiscriminately. We have to do the work of approaching the Corbyn councillors, approaching Labour Party councillors who are prepared to fight. But where the work is being done, including standing candidates against austerity Labour candidates at the ballot box. Now, the steering committee has agreed a model letter to Labour councillors, which is also actually in your agenda pack on page 5, which has already been used in some areas, but we're encouraging all groups to use that immediately. But it's been used, for example, by the comrades in Lewisham, where Labour controls the council with 53 councillors out of the 54 seats on the council. And the response has been interesting. The Corbyn councillors in Lewisham are not opposed to a dialogue, actually, and that's very important for us to note. But we also have to say, from the feedback that we've had, they're not confident of defying the Labour whip in a council group of 53, but there's 6 or 7 of them. And one actually wrote, so I'm not going to name these comrades because we want to have a dialogue. This is a genuine attempt to discuss with these individuals. But one of them actually wrote back and said, many of us are waiting for instructions from Jeremy Corbyn. and that shows what needs to be done. If the national leadership make policy decisions for Labour group leaders, that will help us. And that's absolutely true. But we have to give them the backbone and stiffen them on that. But I also have to say that even some of those, the best if you like, the Corbyn councillors, are still raising, unfortunately, the old arguments. You can't act illegally, councillors have no powers, it's council officers who decide. And even though, I think as a general rule, we get a better coverage, TUSC gets better coverage, more coverage, we found that over the summer, from the Telegraph, the Times, the right-wing press, it does from the Guardian, Channel 4 and the alleged progressive media, so you don't believe what you read in the Guardian in particular. Patrick Winter consciously didn't call it the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition, called us the Trade Unionists and Socialist Campaign, consciously distorted our position by saying that we're advocating not setting budgets, which is not the position at all. And of course, if you ask John McDonnell a stupid question, you get a stupid answer back. And John McDonnell said, well, I don't think the councils should take that road. We agree with that. And then he said, according to the Guardian, that they have no options. But we'll see whether that really is the position. Because there's not time to go into the details in this session, or for me to go into details. And the steering committee has agreed that we will produce briefing papers on these points. But in general, we have to be clear, that is not true. Councils do have the power and the ability to resist the cuts. Actually, one of the reasons being, because there's been no revolt for 30 years in local governments, the ruling class and their political representatives, both in New Labour and in the Tories, have become complacent. The Localism Act, for example, that was passed in 2011 by the Condemn Coalition, actually gives a power of competence to councils to the same degree as any individual. They can do anything they like, as long as it's, apart from that, this is the word, apart from that which is specifically prohibited. So, for example, even in some councils have started council house building by using their pension funds. Only a handful of councils, only a handful of houses built. But why can't that be developed into the next period? So the law does give that flexibility. The power to surcharge councillors that was used against the Liverpool and Lambeth councillors in the 1980s, that has been abolished in 2000. The Audit Commission, which appointed district auditors to be used against the Liverpool and Lambeth councillors, has been abolished in the purge of the Quangos. So councils have more flexibility in relation to that. The legal protection that was put in place after the end of the 1980s to stop councils bluntly sacking obstructive chief executives, that's been repealed. So it's now possible for councillors to defy officers. If the officer gives you advice, this is a budget they don't approve of, they can find another job in another council. In other words, those powers are there. So we have to open up a dialogue with those councillors. Use the model letter now. That's what it's there for. Councils are already starting their budget making process. They are already, council unions are already getting letters saying, with ideas for next year's budgets, cuts coming through. Community groups will start to get their consultation notices soon. So TUSC groups, TUSC branches from this conference should be going to the local unions, going to the community campaigners, going to the Corbyn councillors and looking to organise with them conferences, anti-cuts, local anti-cuts conferences, draw up a people's budget in your area, which can then be presented, used as a campaign tool and presented to the council next February, March. Not just against the cuts, but also, by the way, on positive demands. And the Lincoln TUSC group have moved an amendment, for example, on the question of council setting up housing letting agencies, which is the type of positive demands that could be included in a people's budgets conference. And they should become real campaign documents. They should be taken into the communities, to the trade unions, to the Corbyn councillors, to be presented to the council meetings in March, or February or March, either by one of the Corbyn councillors being prepared to defy the whip, or by using the provision to, for public petitions to be presented in the council, like, for example, Portsmouth TUSC did last year, I believe. But we shouldn't overcomplicate this. We use the phrase people's budget, gets an idea of what can be done. But last year, the comrades in Leicester, the two TUSC supported councillors in Leicester, hosted a people's budget conference. They approached community groups, they got ideas, they pulled the ideas together, they presented it, not as a one-page amendment, using Leicester's reserves, so there's no cuts and the demands of the people's budget should be implemented. But Wayne Naylor is here today, the councillor who's behind that, one of the councillors who's behind that. But bluntly, Wayne himself would say it's not rocket science to move a one-page sheet of paper saying no to the cuts and drawing on the council reserves and so on. And that's the type of thing that we need to be doing. Because that's the way that we should be approaching next year's elections. In the 128 councils where there are local elections next year, half of them Labour controlled. While national events will clarify the dividing line between the two Labour parties, between the Corbyn Labour and austerity Labour, we need to sort out on the ground who is prepared to fight and who isn't. And it's in that context that the question is posed, as it says in the TUSC statements. TUSC will work with any Labour councillor who backs the call to refuse to implement the cuts, but any politician who votes for cuts cannot be allowed a free run at the ballot box, no matter what party label they wear. And I will end with one last point. This November represents 25 years since Thatcher was overthrown as a result of the mass anti-poll tax movements. But let's remember, that was a movement that did not have the support of the Labour Party. There was many Labour MPs who refused to pay the poll tax alongside Dave, as support Corbyn in the Parliamentary Labour Party today. In other words, a handful, not that many at that stage. It was a movement outside the Labour Party in the main. It had the support from some Labour councillors individually and one or two full councils, but in Liverpool, where even by 1990 there was still a left council there. That was the issue, by the way, that the left was finally removed by the Labour Party NEC in 1990. But that mass movement forced not just the resignation of Thatcher, but it forced the Tories to spend 4.3 billion, £7 billion in today's money, to pump that money into local government in order to finance the abolition of the poll tax. Events don't repeat themselves, but a new opportunity is opening up in the struggle against austerity. A new opportunity is opening up on so many fields: the anti-union laws, the struggle of young people, the anti-austerity struggle in the councils and around council budgets. And we have to seize those opportunities to build in the period ahead.